Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Wacker. I'm pleased to be back as your MC for today's Central Coast Economic Forecast virtual edition. You know, we met just over a year ago at the Madonna Expo Center. If you were there, you remember how we sat next to each other, we broke bread together, we even touched the same salt shaker at that table. We shook hands, some people hugged. We talked about whether it would be Sanders or Warren going up against Donald Trump this year in the presidential election. I mean, Biden was fading fast. We all can see that. The economy was rolling along. The rates were steady. The stock market was on this great upward trajectory. U.S. fiscal and monetary policy not changing much. You remember, right? Good old 2019. Well, you know, I read on Facebook this morning that hardly anything has changed since last November. It's just the same old, same old. But there's a chance that I might be misinformed. Apparently, there's a lot of misinformation going around on social media. In all seriousness, of course, 2019 seems like so 5 years ago. None of us have ever seen a year remotely like 2020, a global pandemic, lockdowns, the quickest stock market crash and recovery in history, a massive fiscal and monetary support, widespread civil unrest, and a shocking election season, shocking to some. Most of us are more than ready for 2020 to be done. In fact, this year has been changing so rapidly and substantively that this annual event is our third and final installment of our 2020 series, Economy in Focus. The series was designed to make sure people had vital economic data in our community all throughout the time of uncertainty here in 2020. Now, the recordings of parts 1 and 2 are on the Central Coast Economic Forecast website. Today's program is also being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to that. The Central Coast Economic Forecast is, of course, produced by volunteers, a volunteer board who have been harder at work this year than any year previously. And leading the board this year is the chair, Jeff Thoma, who is the vice president for Thoma Electric. And I'm going to hand it over now to the chairman of the board of the Central Coast Economic Forecast, Jeff Thoma. Jeff?
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's program. I'm Jeff Thoma, chair of the 2020 Central Coast Economic Forecast. First and foremost, we want to extend our well wishes and hopes that you and your loved ones are staying healthy and your business remains steady and strong. Today's program is made possible by many hours of hard work by the CCEF Board of Directors. And I'd like to personally thank each and every member serving on our board for your passion and commitment to producing this series for our community. I'd especially like to thank two of our esteemed board members who have been with the CCEF project since its inception on the Central Coast, Mike Manchek and Anita Robinson, who will both be stepping down after this year. Thank you both for your leadership and many years of contributions to this organization. You will be missed. I'd also like to thank our behind-the-scenes help from AMF Media Group, who have led the charge in the Forecast Project's public relations and marketing strategy, as well as the local chambers of commerce in San Luis Obispo, Paso Robles, South County, and Atascadero for the promotional support to spread the word about our exciting program today. Supplementing the board of directors is our incredible operations manager, Stephanie Bertu, who has been absolutely instrumental in coordinating the efforts of this event. Thank you so much for your time and talent. Bob Wacker is back with us again as our esteemed MC. We're so thankful to benefit from your charm and quick wit. Thank you so much, Bob. And finally, I'd like to sincerely thank all of our viewers for your ongoing support and sponsorship of the forecast, especially this year. On behalf of the board of directors, I would like to thank you, all of our sponsors, for your contribution to bringing economic data and analysis to our community at a time when it is sorely needed. In particular, I'd like to offer special recognition to our 5 platinum sponsors: Amazon, AMF Media Group, Bank of America, Cal Poly Technology Park, and KSBY. Each of our platinum sponsors has recorded a short greeting to share with you throughout the program. Thank you to KSBY for producing these pieces. To kick the day off, we'll start with this greeting from Bank of America. Enjoy the show.
Hello, I am Greg Bland, Bank of America Market President and Commercial Banking Executive here in San Luis Obispo County. It is my honor to be a part of today's virtual Central Coast Economic Forecast. First, a note of gratitude to all of our frontline and essential workers, healthcare providers, and so many more. Also, thank you to the Central Coast Economic Forecast and Beacon Economics for all the hard work they do every year to prepare for this forecast. Gaining an understanding of our community's economic future feels more important than ever. And this year has certainly been different. The pandemic has brought us together more as a community, given us an unwavering focus on not just being resilient, but also in advancing our economic opportunities. To do our part, Bank of America is working with the small business community to provide flexible loan payment plans, as well as lending through the PPP program. We are also finding ways to help the region's workforce better manage work-life balance during these unprecedented times. For an example, we're working with SLO and EVC to increase child care for essential workers, as well as paying our own employees $100 per day for child care needs. This has been an extraordinary year for all of us, but we're committed to doing more, and we can't do it without each of you. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the forecast.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to B of A for their sponsorship. On behalf of the board, we want to thank Jeff Thoma for his service to the board the last 2 years as chair. A chair so nice, they made him do it twice. Normally, we'd have a thank you gift to hand through the Zoom box, but we haven't figured out exactly how to do that. So, Jeff, you'll get your gift later, but thank you for your service. We have a couple of housekeeping items. Remember that this is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting, so you can't be seen or heard. So you can yell at me, even better, yell at Chris. You can make popcorn and eat it with gusto. Nobody will hear or see you. We are saving 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A session with all three presenters. You can submit questions through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. There's not a Q&A box, but submit it through the chat box and we'll get those questions to deal with at the end of today's program. Now, savvy attendees might recognize that starting with Chris Thornberg, it is a change to our usual typical lineup. He usually closes the program with the national forecast, but given the presidential election and the impending changes at the national level, the COVID plan and how it might change, we're going to begin with Chris today. Now, bios for all of our presenters are in your digital program, and today we'll be hearing from Chris about the state and national economy in the next stage of recovery, from Dr. Tanner Osman about SLO County's economic recovery, Adam Fowler about economic development in the age of COVID-19, and as time allows, Chris will summarize the presentation before we get to our Q&A at the end with all three presenters, which we hope will have about 15 minutes. Now, one thing we don't have this year is our red and green cards, which those of you who are, I'm not sure my green will show up here. Yes, at Madonna Expo, when we ask you some questions, we're doing it online this year in a virtual format. And our question is, if we can bring up that poll, it's an online poll, audience poll. Do you expect your revenues for your business or your nonprofit or whatever entity you're representing to be better in 2021 than they were for 2020? So please vote yes or no, and we'll give you the results in a little bit after Chris speaks. Now, while you're voting, I'll tell you that Dr. Chris Thornberg is the founding principal of Beacon Economics and is widely considered to be one of California's leading economists. Dr. Thornberg is a panel member of the National Association of Business Economists Quarterly Outlook. He also serves as chair of the California Chamber of Commerce Economic Advisory Council, is on the board of directors of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, is an executive member of the Central City Association Los Angeles, and is a member of the California Association for Local Economic Development. In his spare time, Chris is the director of the UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, and an adjunct professor at the school. Since we last saw Chris just 2 short months ago, he has delivered upward of a dozen regional economic updates. Chris may be going a bit more negative on the work at home productivity, as his now 2 full-blown toddlers have infiltrated not only his Zoom background, but his Zoom foreground. They take center stage. Most importantly, he's been busy, very busy, celebrating his beloved Dodgers World Series victory almost nonstop for weeks now. So A tip of the hat to you from this Giants fan, Chris, and it's all yours. Take it away.
All right, Bob. Thank you so much. And I will tell everybody it's a disappointment not to be with you at the Madonna Expo Center. Obviously, one of my favorite locations in the state to deliver a speech. At the worst of times, it's one of my favorite places. And of course, when Bob's there, it makes it the best of times. So hopefully next year, Bob, will be able to exchange our barbs in person, as the case may be. I have been with you. This is my third time this year talking to you, to say the least. I'm excited, of course, because today I got a little bit of backup. As noted, I have Tanner Osman coming in to deliver the local outlook, and Adam Fowler will be talking a little bit about economic development, which Beacon actually is doing a little bit more work in nowadays, as the case may be. But I'm going to lead out today, of course, with a big conversation about the big picture, as the case may be. And look, for those of you who've been here for the last couple talks, you understand sort of the big picture, how I've come at this whole thing. There's no doubt that the situation we're dealing with today is truly tragic. 53 million cases globally, 1.2 million deaths, 20% of all those cases and deaths right here, of course, inside the United States. United States and Europe at this point in time are both in the midst of their largest surges to date. Although it's worth noting that as big as these surges are, the death rates have been falling pretty much across the board. And while we're dealing with, of course, this enormous third surge, we have very good news that we now have 2 vaccines that both have shown 95% effectiveness. So as tough as the news is, and coming into the holiday season and what this may mean for our families as we deal, of course, with the current outbreak, also good news. It looks like we truly are getting to the end of this thing. Of course, my conversation has been less involved about the virus itself and more involved with the impact of the virus on the economy globally and, of course, here in the United States. And this boils down to the U versus V debate. To remind you, the U camp, of course, has suggested that this thing is going to be a long, painful situation. It's going to take years to overcome the challenges that have been generated by this. Here at Beacon, we've said right from the get-go, we don't buy that. As tragic as this is, it's tragic in as much as it's a global natural disaster. That's how we've thought about it. And the thing about natural disasters, what history tells us, is they do not have long-run implications for the economy. Obviously, it generates tremendous amount of uncertainty and turmoil in the short run, but the shock to the system is largely transitory. It doesn't have the long-run impacts that is typically associated with a normal type business cycle. Now, I will tell you, we've been in the V camp right from the get-go. For those of you, again, who've seen my presentations, and I'd like to tell you that actually the data to date pretty much backs that up. Look, this is the deepest recession in U.S. economic history. It's also the shortest. Very unusual. Enormous decline in economic activity over 2 months. That's it. The recession ended in April. We've been bouncing back. The worst quarter in economic history, Q2, was followed by the best quarter for growth in the economic history in Q3, negative 31%, plus 33%. We are most of the way back, but obviously we're not all the way back. And all the way back can only occur when we truly get control over this virus. But again, a lot of good news. Since April, the economy has been roaring back. And really, despite the fact that we're now in the midst of this third surge, it does not seem to be threatening yet another downturn in the economy. The most you could say about the second and third surge of these cases is that it's simply slowed the path back to normality. Ultimately, particularly with the vaccines coming online, our anticipation is the virus will be brought under control some point in the beginning of next year. And given all the dry powder that is currently in the system, because of the fiscal and monetary policy that were put in place earlier this year, we expect that once the virus is brought under control, we're going to rock it back to normality. And probably by the end of next year, most ancient history. Now, our concern is not so much about, again, the economy's path. We think it's pretty much baked into the cake over the next year, given where we are. Our problem is that the excessive nature of monetary and fiscal policy, combined with the fact that they may have more fiscal and monetary policy coming into place, once the new administration gets into the White House, suggests we could have a very large problem with both fiscal debt as well as the potential for inflation. We've over-responded to this, largely, of course, driven by this miserablest tendency to take, yes, something that is truly a tragic circumstance, but we've turned it into, if you will, some existential threat to our economy when it never was. And the policy overreaction is in itself potentially laying the seeds for the next downturn. Now, you've all seen the headlines. We've gone through this. California's going to have a $54 billion deficit. Home prices rose in June, but they're going to fall any point now. We had these incredibly negative forecasts. Our good friends over at the UCLA forecast suggested we were going to have double-digit unemployment going into 2022. Depression-like crisis, they called it. A little bit embarrassing when, of course, the unemployment rate is already well below 10% at this particular point in time. But none of this should be a surprise to folks. Remember, everything in the news nowadays is heavily tilted towards the negative. And by the way, that's not a blue or a red comment. That's just how the world works nowadays. We seem to always want to make the worst case scenario out of everything. And a good classic example of that had to do with the Congressional Budget Office and the forecast they put together. If you think about the Great Recession, remember the worst downturn in the post-World War II period, the pain of the Great Recession was not constrained to the 6 quarters of the recession itself. In fact, if you want to think about a full business cycle, it's the recession, that is to say, peak to the bottom of economic activity, combined with the pace of getting back to normality. When you think about the Great Recession, it was a 9-year business cycle, 6 quarters on the way down, but 7.5 years to get back to normal levels of economic output. That's what the CBO prediction I'm showing you here is. It's the gap between what our nation could produce versus what we are actually producing. Now, if you look at the CBO's forecast, you could say they have pretty much close to the same grim thought process here. 7.5 years about to get back to normal levels of economic activity. That's a giant hit. In fact, this would make it the second worst downturn in the history, and since the post-World War II period, excuse me, not since the history of the United States, but a very, very severe downturn. And one of the big questions is, why would you predict something so incredibly negative? Well, it's really twofold. One, it's a misinterpretation of the underlying data. It's just the standard assumption that every business cycle is inherently the same when it is not. As we noted right from the get-go, this is a completely different kind of business cycle, and the lessons of the past don't apply here. And of course, it's a little bit of the generals always fighting the last war. You know, this is an old cliche, but one that has such a resounding level of truth. I still remember in 2007 when real estate started to fall apart and it was clear that the housing market was going to have a rough ride ahead. A lot of folks said, yeah, it's okay. Let housing clear itself out. The Federal Reserve knows how to handle business cycles. The last 2 recessions were bad, ergo this one isn't going to be bad. That's not how you discuss how long it takes to recover from a business cycle. You have to think long and hard about what causes the actual business cycle. It's not what happened last time. That's a dumb forecast. A smart forecast is thinking about the roots of the particular situation we're in. You go back to the Great Recession, it's pretty clear why that was such a painful circumstance. It's because the U.S. economy was so excessively overstimulated in, of course, the run-up to that particular downturn, driven by that subprime bubble that so dominated the economy in the first half of the last decade. $15 trillion of new debt entering the economy with basically no underwriting in the midst, of course, of the greatest fraud in financial history, this asset-backed security fraud. Somehow Wall Street convinced regulators and investors that no, you could take a bunch of really bad debt, slap it into an asset-backed security and layer it off, and it's gold-plated AAA debt. Well, obviously it's not, but that's not what caused the recession to be so long in terms of beginning to end. It had to do with the fact that while that money was pouring into the economy, it caused the economy to grow the ways that just were not sustainable. And when the wheels started falling off the train in 2007, think about what we had to deal with. Millions of jobs that were created in housing and consumer finance wiped out permanently. Those people had to build new careers and new income flows. We had enormous stock problems. We had too many homes and too many cars and too many refrigerators. Households came out of with huge balance sheet problems where they had too much debt. It took years of saving to pay it off and get themselves back into a normal financial situation. And let's not to forget that the financial markets were shattered to their core. And there truly was a chance of a major meltdown. And that, again, took years to get over. This time around, the pandemic, as tragic as it was, it hit an economy that was fundamentally sound. In fact, in a lot of ways, remember the conversation we had when I was with you last year, the soundest this economy has been in probably something on the order of 30 years. Yes, an incredibly deep downturn, but one hitting a healthy economy. And of course, healthy economies can bounce back quickly. Now, it isn't to say, obviously, this is not a harmless circumstance. While the economy is closed down, while people can't work, while certain businesses can't operate and earn revenues, there is harm building up in the system. Remember, if you go back to the first talk, I said, look, here's these 5 questions. Answer these 5 questions. It would tell you how much harm will build up in the system and ergo, and then leading to, of course, how long a recovery will be. As you could tell, we went through these questions. We said this is not that big of a circumstance. And indeed, we didn't think it was going to be a long-run situation. Now, as noted, we are already in the midst of recovery. In fact, I want to kind of break down where we are into 4 basic stages. I think it's a good way of thinking about it. As noted, the first part of this is a recession. The recession, by the way, is behind us. Economic activity bottomed out in April, and since then we've been growing. The deepest but shortest recession we've seen on record. Then we moved into recovery stage 1. This is the mitigation stage, and this is where, again, I think a lot of forecasters went wrong. You know, there's no building into their model the idea that, look, people don't live in a cave. You don't tremble in fear in the forest waiting for this thing to pass. You figure out how to live your life, how to run your business, even under challenging circumstances. Mitigation is what's driven the first 75% of the bounce back in activity, learning how to live in the time of COVID. Now, the second part of the recovery is going to be actually getting control over this. And this one obviously has been the most frustrating of all. You know, it felt like we were getting control after wave 1, and then it came back over the summer. Then it felt like we're getting control over the fall, and then it's come roaring back here in the third quarter. The good news on this particular front is we have vaccines. So it seems like we are truly getting to the end of this thing. That's why I give it a check and an X at the same time. The X because we haven't managed to do it up till now, but a check because we're just months away of being able to get this thing under control. Who knows, there may even be a third vaccine about to be delivered. Again, the more the better. It just means there's a quicker rollout, the quicker we get this thing under control. It's also worth noting that the idea that Europe had it right and we had it wrong, I don't buy that. Remember, Europe's dealing with a terrible problem right now as well. It isn't clear how we should have dealt with this. There's going to be a lot of unpacking afterwards. There's going to be some uncomfortable conversations to be had. Ultimately, that'll be a conversation we have next time around. Last but not least is going to be once we get control over the virus in the first few months of next year, then what? How fast do we then recover from the damage that was done over the course of the 12 months while we've been fighting the virus? And the answer is very, very rapid, because the first set of stimulus, monetary and fiscal stimulus, well, they have not actually been given an opportunity to work yet. You have to wait. Remember, the stimulus to date has been largely about giving people money to spend. The problem with this virus is people can't spend money. You're pushing on a string. You're not actually being effective until the virus is brought more fully under control. Wait, the first stimulus is enough. What scares me is the fact that there is just this nonstop chatter that we desperately need a second stimulus. We do not. In fact, I would argue the first stimulus is already too much. There are dangers coming from the first stimulus, and the idea of having a second stimulus on top of it, well, we are just creating problems in 2 or 3 years from now. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. First, let's get into, of course, the recession and recovery stage 1, that is to say the mitigation level. On the left-hand side is monthly GDP. When you're moving this fast, the quarterly numbers don't give you a good sense of what's going on. It's relatively easy to make a monthly estimate. You can see the backdrop here. And again, peak to trough, February to April, and then we started zooming back. If you want to talk about how far off trend we are, that is to say, that's how that CBO forecast is. Right now, we're about 4.2% off trend. So we're still got a ways to go. Right now, we're a 95.8% economy, if you will. That's the way to think about it. Now, mind you, the CBO forecast for all of 2021 was an output gap of about 4%. That forecast is already dramatically wrong. As been proven over and over again, all the folks that have these tremendously negative forecasts they're just wrong. The economy has been coming back. Now, not all of it, but a lot of it has, in a very real sense, a kind of a winner and loser recovery to date. Take, for example, consumer spending. Consumer spending on services is still lagging. Services is where, healthcare is. And remember, a lot of voluntary procedures are simply not happening right now. That's where restaurants are, hotels, airplanes, all those things we'd like to do but can't do sitting in services. But people want to do something. If you can't spend money on hotels and restaurants, hey, let's buy a camper. Let's buy some video equipment. Let's buy stuff. And that's what they're doing. Goods spending on goods is way above trend right now. Retail sales is bouncing back. Take a look on the right-hand side. This is retail sales. We just got October's number this morning, but this is the September number. Who's the winner? Well, online sales, up well over 20% on a year-over-year basis. Look, what history has proven is that once Jeff Bezos gets a new customer, he doesn't let go of them. Almost assuredly, this surge of sales online is going to remain in place. It's accelerating the desperately needed process of de-retailing. We have too much retail space. We need to start dealing with that. Who else is doing well? Hardware, Lowe's, Home Depot, making money hand over fist. Sports and hobbies. Cars dealerships are doing well. And of course, supermarkets and beverage stores doing great. Bottom of the list, restaurant and bars, still having a problem. Probably going to have a bad fall too if we see more and more closures going on because of this third surge. Gasoline stations obviously getting hit. And of course, clothing stores. That's really, if you will, a broader, it's just kind of a proxy for malls, as the case may be, doing terrible at this particular point in time. Now, mind you, things overall are still good. I love this. The October number came in. U.S. retail sales stagnant amid COVID-19 surge. No, they're not stagnant because of COVID-19. They're way above trend. The problem in retail sales in October, we're running out of space in the garage to put all the stuff we're buying. Time to get back to services because they don't sit in the basement forever. Of course, with good sales coming back, industrial productions come roaring back nicely. Again, winner and loser. Some parts are suffering, but some parts are absolutely thriving. And look how much quicker the bounce back has been relative to where we were during the Great Recession. A much more rapid bounce back in activity than anybody anticipated. And of course, imports are also almost back up to where they were pre-recession trend right now. Exports, not so much. Exports are lagging because the global economy is still struggling with this. The downturn in many parts of the world, particularly Europe, has been more severe than here because they've had greater governmental restrictions, to be honest with you. You take a look at a breakdown in some of the stuff. Oil, way down. Vehicles, aircraft, way down. But again, dairy, pharmaceutical products actually doing pretty well right now. As for business investment, it's still obviously dropped quite a bit as well. Most of the decline here has been on the structure side. Amazingly, equipment sales are only off about 1.9% from where they were a year ago. Not too bad given the severity of everything else. And again, winners and losers. Information processing, way up. Transportation, particularly airplanes, way down. In the intellectual property, movie production, way down. Software, way up. So we can see how the changes in our life driven by this virus are creating changes in the economy. Some parts of the economy doing just great and really carrying things forward. As for the commercial real estate market itself, not a big surprise why everything's been thrown into turmoil. I mean, look, the uncertainty involved in this thing was enormous. And that's particularly driven by all those incredibly negative forecasts. It's not much of a surprise that sales absolutely dropped off a cliff and banks started tightening up. After all, when there's a lot of uncertainty, the last thing you do is start making big bets. Just as simple as that. We all got that, absolutely. But again, remember, as substantial as this is, there's nothing long-term here. It really is a short-run shock. And there's some data from the Bay Area in terms of rents and vacancies. You can see the impact. Take, for example, office vacancies, which have gone up by a full percentage point just in the last year. Now, again, it's not so much that the businesses are emptying out their current space, but absorption of new space coming online is basically non-existent. No one's moving. They're all waiting. They're all sitting back to see how this thing shakes out. But again, given how rapidly things are bouncing back, we expect that things will turn around. As for non-residential permits, surprisingly not bad when you think about it. Typically, you see a collapse. This time around, it's a little bit weak, but not over the top weak. You can see that there's a little bit more confidence here than what, of course, the newspaper would have you believe. And if you want to talk about confidence, let's talk about single-family housing markets. Boy, typically, single-family markets are hyper-cyclical. When the economy is good, single-family markets are good, very good. When the economy is bad, they're very bad. And of course, during the Great Recession, that was kind of on steroids. The housing market was incredibly inflated in the years up to the Great Recession, and then it went down, went through a hit like we've never quite seen before on the way down. This time around, it's a zigzag. The economy is still trying to get back to normality, but housing is way ahead at this point in time. Sales have come zipping back like nobody's business. Prices, which showed a little bit of nervousness at the beginning of this, well, that have already started to bounce back. Anybody who had this idea of buying that house for a 20% discount in a year, forget about it. It ain't happening. And we've talked about this right from the get-go. For housing markets to take a big dump, they have to have some fundamental problems. There were no fundamental problems. Equity levels were near an all-time high level. Vacancies, as opposed to prior to the Great Recession, we had a record high share of units for sale for rent. This time, prior to the pandemic, a record low share. Over the last decade, this housing expansion from a debt perspective is very, very mild in terms of the growth in debt, as well as for the credit score of people who have been borrowing. And remember, housing costs are not that big of a challenge. We mentioned before that the share of mortgage cost or rent burden households in the United States has been falling over the last decade, not increasing. We didn't come into this pandemic with a massive housing cost crisis, the way, of course, that politics sort of invented out of the blue. That crisis just didn't exist. Indeed, the numbers have been kind of weird. Again, it gets the whole idea of how strange things are. Take a look at the home ownership rate in the last couple quarters. It's absolutely just bounced up like nobody's business. In the midst of this incredible downturn, home ownership rates are going up. What's going on? I'm not quite clear on that, to be perfectly honest with you. It may be a lot of folks decided to just go out and buy a home, or maybe people are moving into their second home or investment home because, hey, I'm not going to hang out in San Francisco. It's hard to say what's going on this, but what you can see, again, is not a housing market that's struggling. Quite the opposite. It's one that is thriving, and you can certainly see it in single-family starts. Now, on the multifamily side, things have cooled off. And remember, a little bit of that is investor uncertainty that's driving that particular picture, along, of course, with some scary stories out there, which I'll come to in just a second. Get into California. Home sales have bounced back nicely in the third quarter. Inventories of homes for sale have dropped to levels we haven't seen since pre-Great Recession. This is a tight housing market. It's a seller's market. Anything that goes online out there gets all sorts of sales. And again, you can see the numbers, median prices across the state, zooming forward quite sharply. Contrast this, of course, to the multifamily market. And probably some of the scariest stories of all, of course, are from San Francisco. You probably read some of these newspaper articles that suggest that rents in San Francisco are down 30%. No, they're not. That's based on some data out of Zillow on asking rent prices. It's not, the data is constructed so poorly, you don't know what it's saying. Again, it goes back to the idea that for whatever reason, the general tendency in the news today is just to create a bad story, no matter what the underlying truth of the matter is. Yes, asking rents are down, but again, it's an absorption problem. It's not, if you will, the fact that people can't pay or they're fleeing the city. It's a bunch of new apartments coming online, and of course, people are moving in. People aren't moving at all in the midst, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. Vacancy rates aren't going through the roof. Again, it's an absorption problem, simple as this. And let's remember, we came into the pandemic in California with an incredible housing supply crisis across the state, whether housing units per capita, share of overcrowded housing, the share of vacant housing. California has a massive supply shortage. Supply, not affordability, supply. And of course, when you have a supply shortage, when things get back to normal, obviously any available supply, including San Francisco, is going to be rapidly refilled. So forget about this idea of downtowns emptying out. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. Yes, I get it. People don't want to be downtown right now. Why would you be? But why do people live downtowns? It's not just because it's close to work. They live in downtowns because it's the urban lifestyle. 12 great restaurants you can walk to, museums, theaters, all the things that come with city living, that hustle and bustle that urban folks just love. That isn't going anywhere. Once the economy gets back up and running, people are going to flock back into downtowns. It's transitory, not permanent. As for single-family permits are rising in some places, multifamily down, but overall, again, I think this market is going to come back strongly. And as for, of course, the credit issues, you remember all the hedge fund billionaires calling end of the world, as the case may be, at the beginning of this thing. No, none of those things came true. And never were going to. Remember, we entered this thing with fundamentally solid consumer credit markets, the record low financial obligations ratio, not a lot of debt payments relative to incomes at every income level. And we just got the third quarter data and from the New York Fed Consumer Credit Panel, and it doesn't show any kind of signs in delinquencies. Not a surprise. We've said this all along. It doesn't make any sense. It takes years for credit markets to turn. This is a short-run circumstance. Why were all those hedge fund billionaires on CNBC screaming into the world? Well, two basic reasons. A, that's how they get the Federal Reserve to open up their wallet to them. They got all sorts of bailout from the Federal Reserve, good for them. And of course, B, it also panics equity investors, gets them to sell their stuff so that all those big hedge funds can suck up all those equities at rock bottom prices. Between you and me, it's absolutely immoral to have allowed them to do that and panic investors, but they do it anyway. Remember, what you're seeing on those news stations is not reality. You should have hung on. And next time around, remember, all these crazy volatility in the stock market, it's a sucker's bet, folks. It's nothing more than that. More good news in the mortgage markets, again from the third quarter. Quarterly transition to 30, 60-day late, way down. And I know you're thinking, well, Chris, it's all because people have forbearances. No, yes, there's no doubt that they allowed some forbearances, particularly, if you will, through some of the big, if you will, public lenders, Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie, so on and so forth. But guess what? The share of forbearances is going down, not going up. People are getting back to normal one way or the other. Now, with all this good news of investment coming back and housing coming back and all this stuff, clearly some parts of the economy are suffering. And of course, these parts of the economy are a central part of the San Luis Obispo economy. Tanner's going to get into some of those local numbers in just a little bit. But look, restaurant, hotel spending down 30%, transportation, airplanes, almost 50%, entertainment and recreation down 56%. These parts of the economy will be closed until we get full control over this virus. As simple as this. For these sectors to come back, you need to have that next step on that. Until you do, it's going to be a little tough. And you can see the data. For example, airplanes, we're getting back. We're almost to 35% traffic relative to last year, but we've started to sag again, of course, with this last surge. As for hotels, again, kind of a winner-loser type hotel market. Orange County is sort of my favorite example. You go up, of course, to Anaheim, next to Disneyland, no conventions, families aren't flying, the park is closed. Empty. It's a ghost town in Anaheim. You go down to Dana Point next to that beach, and those hotels were packed over the summer. Households were desperate to get out, to do something with their families, to not be trapped in the house. Again, a bit of a winner-loser, but obviously those losers are having a tough time. There's no doubt about it. They're just waiting for things to clean up. Probably will be mid to end of next year for some of these, particularly the convention business, the big music industry business, to get back up and running. We got a ways to go. Where are we on that front? Well, as noted, we are in the midst of this second surge, although one where we haven't seen the same massive increase in death rates the way we did in the first surge in the United States. It's going up, there's no doubt about it, but still relatively constrained, particularly relative to the number of cases. If you look at where the problems are in the United States, look, there's no doubt that every place is seeing an increase, but the real giant new numbers, of course, is largely in the Midwest. Remember, at some level, this virus has a tendency to explosively grow in places it hasn't been in any intensive level. The Midwest had not been hit yet. It's now really expanding in the Midwest. And of course, it's compounded by the cold weather, pushing people indoors in closer proximity to each other. As for California, no doubt we are still getting hit. Look, we've already been through a surge over the summer. We're now entering, again, a second big surge. We're not back to where we were over the summer, but we're getting there. There's no doubt that is still a problem. Of course, we're already seeing a bunch of counties go back into purple mode, which means more constrictions as the case may be. We're just going to have to work through this and be careful as we get through the holiday season. Now, in the end, we would have gotten through this eventually. You know, the idea of herd immunity has been largely sort of, I think, misinterpreted. Herd immunity is when a large enough share of the population has innate or acquired immunity to this thing to the point that it can't spread at all. Well, remember, that is an ultimate conclusion. You still have, if you will, a resistance curve. The more folks have, of course, some innate or acquired resistance, the harder this thing is to spread. That's why Chicago is having a terrible problem, whereas LA, not so bad as the case may be, again, relative to Chicago. We simply have more immunity at this point in time because we've already dealt with this. Now, of course, the greatest way to get down the resistance curve is a vaccine. Great news on that particular front. And boy, you want to talk about winners and losers. As soon as the Pfizer vaccine was announced, take a look at Delta versus Zoom stock price. Zoom, of course, dropped by about 18%. Delta shot up by about 15%. Everybody's hopeful that this is good for travel, not so much online stuff. This may be a little over the top. My guess is going into the future, every conference is going to have both a virtual and an in-person part of it. We'll come back to that in just a second. The biggest lagging indicator of all, of course, is employment, and the payroll numbers are still way off. Look, we're still 10 million jobs below where we were at the beginning of this thing. But again, it just looks completely different. As big as these numbers are, this job cycle looks nothing like the past. Indeed, we seem to be roaring back towards our initial equilibrium at a pace we've never seen before. And while we have a ways to go, yeah, we're getting there. There's no doubt about it. States in a very similar sort of situation overall. We're substantially below where we were pre-pandemic. California's gotten hit worse than most of the United States for obvious reasons. A, we're more tourism-centric than most of the United States. People from around the world flock here to enjoy the wonderful thing that you and I take for granted living here on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, of course, we've also had, I think, a little bit more draconian restrictions in other places. For example, Arizona never fully closed down the way that California did. Combination of the two, we've been hit a little bit worse, but the same pattern of the bounce back is taking place. One of the reasons so many forecasters got this wrong was a misinterpretation of unemployment. Unemployment, typically, a historical pattern is once it goes up, it takes a long time to come down. I get that. When we ran our model at the beginning of this thing, we also had these kind of crazy draconian results, which said double-digit unemployment for years. But when you dug into the unemployment rate, what you suddenly realized, it was not unemployment in the sense we've seen in past business cycles. At the beginning of this, almost all the new unemployment were people who were on temporary layoff. It was not a lost job in any traditional sense. It's people saying, hey, I have a job, just can't work at it yet. Now, temporary unemployment has fallen tremendously. It's down to about 2%, still elevated, but getting back to more normal levels from a historical standpoint. And while those who are truly unemployed, that share has been rising. It's a little less than 5% right now. Context, during the tech recession, it was about 5.5%. During the Great Recession, it was 9%. In other words, the pandemic has driven a circumstance by which you would say this huge transitory shock to the U.S. economy has generated what you would call a mild recession. And of course, it isn't just people who are employed. We've also seen about a 1% drop in participation rates, I think driven by parents who are forced to stay home because kids can't go to school. Putting that to one side, the numbers are not as bad as they seem on the surface. It's easy to look at that 10 million job gap and go, that's horrifying. But take a look at the job openings rate, almost back to where it was pre-pandemic. While some sectors are still waiting to reopen, other sectors are thriving and they're hiring people. We didn't see anything like this during the Great Recession. Take a look at the right-hand side. This is another important number. This is a comparison of W-2 earnings versus payroll employment. And payroll employment still 7% below where it was pre-pandemic. Earnings are not even down 2%. So most of the jobs are relatively low-paid jobs. And while we still have to worry about those households that depend on that income, those workers that depend on that income, we also have to appreciate that the long-run harm is driven by the loss of income. The loss of income, at least earned income, has been substantially smaller than the loss of jobs. What that means is there's still a fundamental degree of health. And of course, as for small business, I know everybody keeps talking about the wave of bankruptcies. You look at, for example, this is some data from California, San Jose, and small business reopenings. A lot of small businesses have not reopened, particularly small restaurants. They may never reopen. I get that. That's something to worry about. But remember, small business, there's always a tremendous amount of churn. Given this huge shock, transitory shock to the system, I'm not surprised a lot of small businesses said, okay, we're out. But at the same time, take a look at California business applications. This is people applying for a new business permit through the roof. Over the last few months, you've never seen more applications in the 25 years the census has been collecting this particular data. So yeah, a lot of small businesses are closing down and a lot of entrepreneurs are getting ready to open their next business. Giant churn, obviously what that means is on net, yes, no doubt there's going to be some instability, if you will, but we are already seeing the roots of the next big expansion. So how fast will that expansion be? This goes back to, of course, our conversations about stimulus. $3 trillion stimulus plan in the second quarter of the year. Unbelievable. Remember, one quarter, there's $5.5 trillion of economic transactions in the United States. $3 trillion of stimulus. Crazy numbers. And of course, it wasn't just the federal government. It's also, of course, the Federal Reserve getting involved with a massive, of course, quantitative stimulus plan. How big was the stimulus? Remember, the income hit wasn't all that big. This is overall U.S. disposable household income, and I'm breaking it down by source. The purple stuff is earned disposable income. Government benefits are the orange. Take a careful look. Yes, earned income dropped a bit, not as much as people have talked about, but it has dropped a bit. But for every dollar in lost income, the government has put back $2 in terms of stimulus payments. 2 to 1. Now, you ask yourself, why are we still 4.5% below where we should be at this point in time, 4.2% below where we should be at this point in time? The answer is, of course, remember, you're giving households lots of money, but those households can't spend that money. Remember, the things they want to do, take the trip to Disneyland, go out to their favorite restaurant, they're not able to do that right now because of the virus. Giving people money to spend when they can't spend money is like pushing on a string. You're not going to have a big impact. Oops, sorry about that. I'm not sure what I just did there. Okay, sorry, we're back. Again, it just ultimately is, you're just pushing on a string. Now, where has all that money gone then? Look at the banking systems. $2.5 trillion in excess deposits. On the right-hand side, take a look at household savings. $1.3 trillion in excess savings. Households typically save $1 trillion in a year. We've already saved $1.3 trillion on top of that. That's an incredible amount of money sitting there waiting to be spent. Just waiting. And by the way, who's waiting to spend it? Take a look at the breakdown in spending by level of income. This is more data from Opportunity Insights. Low-income households actually are spending more than they did pre-pandemic. That's good news. That means they are managing. Again, winners and losers in there. Some of these households are not struggling. Other ones are doing just fine. Overall, on average, the biggest decline in spending is for high-income households. And I'm not saying that to feel sorry for high-income households. High-income households are doing just fine, thank you very much. The point of this is, again, this is where that dry powder is sitting. High-income households, they have a ton of money sitting there waiting to be spent once they can spend it. This goes back to the idea that when we do get control over this thing in the first part of next year, the economy is going to zoom back to normality. My worry, of course, is the federal government. We just finished the calendar year, the federal fiscal year for the government. Remember, it's Q4 to Q3. And what do we see? $3 trillion deficit. $3 trillion. Now, $1 trillion of that Of course, we came into it already baked into the cake, and the other $2 trillion is the first part of the stimulus. There's going to be more borrowing next year just to keep us above water. And by the way, they're talking about another stimulus plan. This is not good. Why? Well, a couple things. First of all, folks, this isn't free money. For anybody screaming that we need another stimulus plan, are you forgetting that this is called borrowing? We are borrowing this money, and our children will have to pay it back. Remember, this is not free. I'm just amazed that no one has this conversation about the next generation. It's like they don't exist. Whatever. Just give it all to us. Let them figure it out. It's not how you do things. It's embarrassing. And of course, the sheer scale of this, $3 trillion deficit this year, probably a couple trillion over the course of the next fiscal year. What are we talking about? In 2019, all borrowing, federal, state, local, businesses, households, everything together was $3 trillion. We're talking over 2 years, $5 trillion, maybe even borrowing, $6 trillion in borrowing by the federal government. That's going to move the credit markets, folks, particularly when there's not a lot of excess savings sitting around because people are rebuilding their spending patterns. Yeah, that means higher interest rates. And while we're at it, let's talk about the Federal Reserve. You know, I gave A+ to the Federal Reserve through the Great Recession. They did some pretty dramatic things, but they needed to. The financial system was shaken to the core by the debt losses that were occurring as the subprime situation just completely imploded. This time they're acting like the same thing's happening when it is not. They push interest rates down to zero. The federal balance sheet is exploding. But there is no collapse in wealth. There is no massive financial problem. There is no big issues in the debt markets. Stock markets back up to where it was pre-pandemic. Housing prices are going up. In the second quarter, with a negative 33% growth rate, housing wealth went up. We don't need all this monetary stimulus. We don't. And of course, where does that money go? Straight into the money supply. Take a look at the right-hand side. Remember, in the end, inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and money supply growth right now is growing at 25%. We've never seen anything like it. Yes, this is inflationary, not for a couple years. It takes a little while. There's a big gap between money supply turning into inflation. But boy, are we running down that path. A couple years, we could be dealing with a fiscal debt crisis and inflation all at the same time. Last time we saw something like that being dealt with was, say, Greece. This is not a good circumstance. It could be very, very ugly unless we take a step back, start working on closing the federal budget gap as opposed to expanding it, start pulling some of this money out of the system before it becomes inflationary. It worries me a lot. Now, as for the long run, I've made this point plenty of times. Look, pandemics have been with humanity since the dawn of civilization. There's no new normal there. We will go out and live our lives again when things are behind us. But we've learned some important lessons. Probably one of the most important lessons is, well, we'd have too much retail. Time to get going on de-retailing and figuring out what to do with all that land. It's a land use situation. Adam's going to talk a lot about that. We also learned that maybe our employees don't have to be in the office every day. And that will almost assuredly mean less office space demand per office worker. Now, it doesn't mean the death knell of office space. Everybody isn't going to just work from home from here on out. Look, you still need a place for clients. You still need a place for collaboration. And workers who've been at home for 6 months are about to chew their left arm out. They're desperate to go out with coworkers and get away from their kids. It's not a massive change, but it is absolutely a change. And one, of course, that will ultimately benefit us by working with this new thing. But again, there's a lot of conversations. As for the election, boy, the story in the press was Biden is now president and the world is happy again. No, 51% of America is happy again, and 48% of America is pretty upset at this particular point in time. Look, we were a divided nation before Trump came into office, and we're going to be a divided nation after Trump leaves. Overall, looks like the Senate's going to be held by the Republicans. 2 years of divided government. Don't expect any massive changes. The only thing I can say is between Trump and Biden will probably work harder to pull people back to the center and to work together again, as opposed to Trump, who seemed intent on pulling people apart. But beyond that, until we as a nation understand that our political leaders on both sides of the spectrum are going farther and farther in the radical bases, until we understand that everybody has to get pulled back in order for us to have a stable government, that cooperation is what politics is supposed to be about. Until we figure this part out, I am still very, very worried about the political situation in the United States, and I don't see any end to, of course, this credible gridlock. And we talk about governments being out of touch with their, of course, overall population base. The propositions in California sure taught us that our state government is substantially left to the population overall. Look, things that the state government really wanted: Prop 15, the split roll; 16, affirmative action; 21, not all of them, but some, rent control. These all went down pretty substantially, right? 15 was close, but everything else was pretty thick. Whereas, of course, say Prop 22, which was Uber and Lyft's response to AB 5, that passed overwhelmingly. What Sacramento needs to take away from this is no, the state population does not support their particular agenda. The state needs to start thinking about what Californians want, not just their political base. But again, that gets to the heart of the problem. So for me, the best bit of news that comes out of this entire situation is this. Look, Biden and Harris are now in the White House. Obviously, that is going to fundamentally link California to Washington, D.C. We're no longer going to be spending all our time suing, of course, Congress and the president. Instead, we're going to be collaborating with them, and perhaps that'll give our state leaders a little more opportunity to focus on things that we need. We'll see, but obviously, I think ultimately having that connection is good for the state overall. So wrapping it up, basically, I'm not telling you anything different than what I've told you the last two times I was with you. Yes, this global natural disaster, the pandemic, is truly tragic, and our hearts have to go out to the families who've lost loved ones, people who've been hit hard by this disease, who've had a tough time and may still be having a tough time with the after effects of it. But as much as that is tragic and we have to worry about those folks and help those folks, the economy is already in V mode recovery. Worst quarter in economic history, followed by the best. We are still a ways away from getting back to complete normality, but with good news on the vaccine front. That path is pretty much set in stone. 8% growth, 7% growth, maybe in Q4, perhaps a little weaker because if new restrictions go into place. But Q1, Q2, Q3, we expect we're going to be close, very close to full recovery by the second half of next year. Unemployment, I've been saying all along, unemployment below 7% by year end. Guess what? It's already below 7% as of October, probably close to 6.2%. Stock market, who knows? Real estate, look, it's a long-run asset. This is not a long-run shock to the system. It's fine. Obviously, tourism, restaurants, and retail are going to lag. The biggest issue of all is the same issue I've been on stage talking to you about over the last bunch of years when I've had the wonderful opportunity to come San Luis Obispo and enjoy your hospitality. It is our inability as a nation to have honest conversations about what's going on. Look, things can be better. We can always do better by those who need a little help. However, at the same time, we as a nation are prospering, and people above and below at every level of income have a better quality of life today than they did 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago. We instead, though, instead of appreciating all this, we turn everything into the worst possible context. We've convinced ourselves that the United States is in a state of decay and decline. People are starving on their feet and living hand to mouth. And everything in those circumstances becomes an existential threat. And of course, that kind of miserablest behavior is exactly what has led to this excessive degree of monetary and fiscal stimulus. Excessive degree of monetary and fiscal stimulus that is creating the potential for an enormous federal debt problem in just a couple of years, not to mention the potential for inflation. Bad policy leads to bad economic outcomes. And of course, bad politics leads to bad policy. That is the heart of the matter. That hasn't changed. And we all need to get back on the path of healing. Understand that people on the other side of the aisle from you have a lot more in common with you than things you actually disagree on. We've got to take a step back down. We have to tamp down the level of rhetoric. And in the end, we have to reject politicians who politic on the basis of division. It's time for them to understand that politics is the art of compromise. We desperately need compromise to take on the challenges of the world today. And I hope that maybe we'll learn a little bit of a lesson coming out of this pandemic. And of course, last but not least, let's hear for the Dodgers. Finally, a World Series win. Now, mind you, the last couple were tough. We know that the Houston Rockets were cheating, and nobody likes cheating. But putting that to one side, they finally got their rings. Let's hear for the boys in blue. And Bob, don't worry. I'm sure San Francisco will get their next ring in a decade or so. Anytime now. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to our hosts and move on to Tanner to give you the local situation.
Thanks, Chris, and wonderful information as always. And congratulations again. You had not only the Dodgers, but the Lakers this year. Big year for LA in the sports world. Remember that we are taking questions for Chris and then the other presenters as well on the chat box. So please, if you have questions about anything that Chris went over, make sure you put that into the chat box so we'll have some questions. We've had a few come in already. I want to go over the results of our first red and green poll that went out. Again, it was, do you expect your revenues for your business or nonprofit or other entity to be better in 2021 than they were for 2020? And fortunately, we had a 3-to-1 yes vote on that people, 3/4 of them do expect it to be better in 2021. So from their lips and their votes to the business God's ears, the economic God's ears. With that, we're going to have another video now from one of our platinum sponsors, the Cal Poly Tech Park.
Good morning. I'm Jim Dunning, Associate Vice President for Corporate Engagement and Innovation at Cal Poly. Cal Poly is proud to support the 2020 Central Coast Economic Forecast. At Cal Poly, we believe investment in people and infrastructure is vital for economic growth. With the financial support from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, Cal Poly is investing in the expansion of our Cal Poly Technology Park. Building upon the success of the existing technology park, Cal Poly is expanding the park to bring together students, faculty, and businesses in support of high-tech economic development on the Central Coast. The expanded technology park will draw the best and brightest from Cal Poly to work in and for the companies of the future. I can't think of a time when investing in our future was more important than it is right now. Thank you for engaging, and thank you for your investment in the Central Coast.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the Cal Poly Tech Park. What a wonderful addition to our community. We're going to move on now. I'm going to tell you that Dr. Tanner Osman is the director of the regional and sub-regional analysis at Beacon Economics. Tanner's focus is on California's regional economies, and it's continued throughout the pandemic. He's recently presented outlooks for the Inland Empire at the UC Riverside Center for Economic Forecasting's 2020 conference and at the Southwest Regional Economic Forecast, where he joins city managers from the area to talk about the direction their cities are headed. Tanner has also assumed the lead role in Beacon's monthly California Labor Employment Report, and in the process has become a bit of a media darling. In the past couple months, he's been quoted by the LA Times, the Sacramento Bee, the Orange County Register, and NPR, just to name a few. So here today to give us an update on the Central Coast economy and what we can expect coming forward is Dr. Tanner Osman. Tanner?
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And just to echo some sentiments that Chris made at the outset, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, but it's a shame that we can't be there with you in person. So I'd very much look forward to the opportunity to join you all in San Luis Obispo next year, hopefully. So whereas Chris was focusing on the macro picture, as Bob mentioned, I'm going to be talking more about the local economy and what's been happening in San Luis Obispo and San Luis Obispo County. And my talk is really going to be divided into 4 primary parts. First, I'm just going to provide a quick update on COVID-19 in the San Luis Obispo region. As many of you will have seen, the virus is spreading, it seems, nearly everywhere, and this has led to further restrictions from the state. And in the short term, this is going to have some impact on certain sectors of the economy. I'm then going to get into understanding where the economy stood prior to 2020. So before the pandemic came along and changed all of our lives for much of this year, I'm going to report where the economy was and the good news is that prior to the pandemic, San Luis Obispo's economy was doing very well. Thank you very much. Now, as always, there is some room for improvement with respect to the economy, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the capacity constraints that were faced in San Luis Obispo County. In the third part of my presentation, I'm just going to be talking about what has happened to the economy this year in 2020. And I'm really going to be dividing my comments up into four major categories. I'm going to be discussing what has been happening with the labor market after we saw such a dramatic drop in employment in April of this year. We saw a very strong recovery in the labor market heading into the early summer, although the growth and the recovery has slowed a little as we've come into the autumn. Very similar picture with respect to consumer activity as well. Again, we saw this dramatic drop, which has been followed by a very quick bounce back, which has moderated somewhat again as we've come into the autumn. I'm going to then wrap up the discussion of the 2020 economy by discussing the real estate market, which really has been a bright spot, perhaps the brightest spot in the San Luis Obispo economy. The residential real estate market in particular has put in a very impressive performance as we moved into the third quarter. And then in the very final part of my presentation, I'm just going to be looking out to 2021. We might be facing a short-term speed bump, but with a lot of, encouraging news surrounding vaccines. I think we all expect 2021 to be a year of strong growth. And then I'll also sort of cast my eye out a little bit beyond 2021 and talk about some of these capacity constraints which are being faced by the economy and some of the challenges which the local economy might face as we head beyond 2021. So just by way of a quick update on COVID-19, as I mentioned, San Luis Obispo hasn't been able to escape what seems to be a national trend of rising counts of new cases. So just in the last week, we saw record-setting days within the region. The good news, and I hate to sort of frame deaths as good news, but compared to other regions, San Luis Obispo has seen far fewer deaths, and deaths have been much less prevalent in San Luis Obispo than has been the case in many other parts of the country. So while we don't want to see 34 deaths related to the pandemic, San Luis Obispo has been able to avoid some of the larger numbers that we've seen in other places. And just in the last week as well, we have seen hospitalizations ticking up as well. So as we sort of look out, over the next few months, I think it's anybody's guess as to the trajectory that the virus is going to take. But what we do know is that as of Monday, Governor Newsom returned many counties across California back to purple tier, which is the most restrictive tier with respect to constraints on consumer activity and business activity. And as I again mentioned at the outset, this is going to have a disproportionate impact on certain sectors of the economy. A theme that we'll get to later in the presentation is how the leisure and hospitality sector is being affected as a result of the pandemic. And in the short term, it's hard to see these constraints as being good news for the leisure and hospitality sector in particular. So where were we before 2020 came along? Well, the San Luis Obispo economy was seeing a period of sustained job growth. We sort of trace economic performance back to the time of the Great Recession. Each and every year, the economy has been adding jobs. And not only that, the jobs have been paying better wages over time. So we've seen pretty impressive wage growth as represented by this orange bar as well. If we were to look at the table on the right, it displays the sectors in which employment in San Luis Obispo County are concentrated. And there are really three primary sectors which make up around about 1 in 2 jobs. Around about 45% of the jobs are found in leisure and hospitality, healthcare, and the retail sector. And I just want you to remember the share of jobs that are found in leisure and hospitality. Around about 16% or 1 in 6 jobs are found in the leisure and hospitality sector. And later on, when I discuss the labour market recovery and how the labour market recovery in San Luis Obispo hasn't been quite as strong as it has been in other parts of the state. This is primarily due to the heavy concentration of jobs in San Luis Obispo County in the leisure and hospitality sector, which is a sector which really has been disproportionately impacted by the economic fallout. Another way that we can see the performance or measure the performance of the San Luis Obispo economy is just to look at the job growth and compare it to a bunch of other places. And as you can see, over this sort of 10-year period, San Luis Obispo, as represented by this pale green line here, has outperformed many cities of a similar size, and more importantly, has outperformed the job growth that we've seen in California as well. And in fact, this table shows us that over the last 5 years, San Luis Obispo's job growth has been somewhat on par, almost identical to the job growth that we've seen in the rest of the state. Now, in the last year...
Tanner, excuse me, you need to share your screen. Folks see you but can't see your screen.
Oh, okay. That is a big problem. Okay. Where is the, excuse me, I thought I was sharing my screen, apologies. Okay, is my screen being shared now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, well, apologies. The only slide that we had missed of any substance was this slide here, which was just showing the job growth that we'd seen over the 10-year period. And I was just describing the table here in which we saw that 3 sectors account for around about 50%, 45% of the jobs in the San Luis Obispo County economy. So that would have been leisure and hospitality, healthcare, and retail, which together, like I said, make up around about 1 in 2 jobs. And I was describing the importance of the leisure and hospitality sector in particular to local employment. I had just moved on to this slide here, so we didn't fall too far behind, thankfully. And I was just showing how job growth over an extended period of time in San Luis Obispo County, represented by this pale green bar, had outperformed the state of California. And you can see that as well in this table on the right, whereby over the last 5-year period, over the last 5 years leading into the pandemic, San Luis Obispo's job growth was on a par with the job growth that we've seen in California. Both economies had grown by or added jobs at around about 11% over this period. Now, in this chart on the right, we see the unemployment rate. This time, San Luis Obispo is represented by the dark green bar. And you can see that prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate in San Luis Obispo County stood at below 3%. To be precise, the number was 2.9%. And so we have a lot of good news surrounding the economy: impressive job growth, impressive wage growth, record low unemployment rate. And then as we sort of dig a little bit deeper into the data, what we see is that the economy prior to the pandemic was starting to run into some what we might call capacity constraints. So if we look at the growth of the labor force in San Luis Obispo on this left chart here, we see that in 2014, or since 2014, the labor force has been moving sideways. So the labor force in the county hasn't been growing over this period. And what does this tell you? Well, this tells you that if you're a local business looking to expand, there's not a lot of capacity in the local labor market. When you have an unemployment rate of sub 3%, coupled with the fact that the labor force is not expanding, it tells you that there's not a lot of room for expansion within the local economy. And this is a theme that I'm going to come back to as we move along. And this sort of theme of a plateauing economy can also be seen with respect to business activity. So if we were to look over the last 5 years, we often measure sort of business activity, local consumption activity, by using sales tax revenue. What we see is sort of a plateauing formation whereby there hasn't been a lot of growth in sales taxes for a number of years now. And in fact, in the year prior to the pandemic, so if we were to measure growth from 2018 to 2019, sales tax revenue was flat within the county. And again, this comes back to this idea of the economy running into some short-term, perhaps even medium-term capacity constraints. And again, we see a very similar picture with respect to the housing market as well. We've seen very impressive house price growth. Going back to 2010, we can see that house price have nearly tripled in the region, which of course is great for homeowners. But what we have seen as well at the same time is that sales, again, have been plateauing somewhat. If we were to look at home sales within the county, again, we come back to this period at around about 2014, 2015, where we've been moving in somewhat of a sideways formation. And in this chart on the right here, you can see home sales measured on a year-over-year basis. So from 2018 to 2019, home sales in San Luis Obispo were effectively flat. So what is the cause of the slowdown in growth of the labor force? What is the cause of the sort of plateauing of home sales? Well, ultimately, it comes back to housing supply. So in this chart on the left here, we're looking at the months of supply of single-family homes in San Luis Obispo County. Of course, California itself is grappling generally with a very similar problem. And what we see is there's about 3 months worth of inventory. So if we were to stop building housing today, within 3 months, that supply which is on the market would be totally consumed. So it's a sign of a very tight housing market. And in this chart on the right here, you can just see how quickly homes snapped up as soon as they appear on the market. So the median time for a single family home to be on the market is around about 20 days. Again, another sign of a constrained housing market as we were heading into the pandemic. And we see, again, not to sound like a broken record, but we see this sort of plateauing formation when it comes to commercial permits. So if we look at the valuations of commercial permits that were issued, again, going back to around about 2013, 2014, we've been slightly up 1 year, slightly down another year, but overall we do see somewhat of a plateauing trend within the region. So overall, prior to the pandemic, very impressive, strong growth, employment growth, very impressive wage growth, but the economy was starting to run out of steam a little bit due to some of the restrictions in the region with respect to housing supply. So then 2020 comes along, and I don't think that 2020 is going to go down in the annals as a year that we're all going to look back upon fondly. And of course, there has been a considerable economic fallout and a recovery, of course, from this fallout. So if we were to look at the labor market, what we've seen was that in the months of April and May in particular, we saw significant job losses in San Luis Obispo County. And the chart on the right really demonstrates the sectors which have been the most affected. So if we were to look at the change in a number of jobs in San Luis Obispo County from February to September of this year, we see that leisure and hospitality jobs have fallen by 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 leisure and hospitality jobs have been lost to the region over this period. One of the other things that I'd like to point out about this chart as well is how much the economy the labor market is contracted in totality. There are nearly 13% fewer people employed in San Luis Obispo in September than there was in February. And this is actually faring a little bit worse than the state of California, where that number is around about 9.5%. Okay, so San Luis Obispo has underperformed so far to this point the performance of the California economy, which of course has slightly underperformed the US economy. And a lot of that does come down to the fact that or going back to that original slide I showed about the San Luis Obispo economy, where such a large concentration of the county's jobs are in the leisure and hospitality sector. So when you have a combination of an economy which was heavily centered in leisure and hospitality, coupled with the fact that leisure and hospitality has been the hardest hit sector, not just in San Luis Obispo, but in the state of California and in a nation, this adds up to an underperforming labor market recovery with respect to some other places that we would like to compare San Luis Obispo County to, such as the state of California. And this chart on the left here really tells a picture of just how dramatic the drop in jobs was in San Luis Obispo in April. Between April and May, nearly between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 jobs had been lost from the economy. We saw a sharp snapback in June, but as we've seen both in California and nationally, this labor market recovery has lost a little bit of steam. Now, in the most recent month in September, there was actually a loss of 300 jobs locally in the economy. I wouldn't dwell too much on that number. These numbers, whether it was plus 300 or less 300, what this is really telling us is that the trend has been downwards. Now, obviously, we would like that trend to reverse and to go back to my very first slide about the COVID economy. A lot of the restrictions that have been put in place are not going to be beneficial to the leisure and hospitality sector, in particular in the short term. So we really need to get over this hump with respect to COVID before we can start to see the labour market gather that momentum that it was experiencing come the summertime. In this chart on the right here, well, we're just tracking, or this is just demonstrating the respect to which San Luis Obispo's recovery has underperformed California. California is represented here in a dark blue line. And you can see, as I mentioned before, that California's labour market is still around about 9% lower than it was in February of this year, whereas as we saw, San Luis Obispo is hovering at around 13%. The good news is that the inflated unemployment rates that we saw not only in California but in San Luis Obispo County have come back down to earth somewhat. So the unemployment rate in San Luis Obispo County, while it's not where it was prior to the pandemic, has fallen below 8%, which is an encouraging sign. A slightly worrying sign in the short term is the fact that the labour force has contracted within San Luis Obispo County. So what this means is that a number of people have become somewhat discouraged and stopped looking for work in the short term. And many of you will have seen stories about how the labour force has been affected, or has particularly affected female workers who in many families have taken on the responsibility of taking care of children, many of whom are being educated from home. So in the short term, we have seen a contraction of the labour force. Despite some of the slowing in the recovery with respect to the labour market, there are green shoots to be seen. And thanks to some members of the local community with whom we've been able to have discussions, we were able to sort of gather an on-ground perspective of how the recovery in the region is proceeding. So while it's the case that leisure and hospitality has seen a big fallout with respect to employment, if we were to look at TOT tax, we do see that actually was up on a year-over-year basis from August 2019 to August 2020. So that is, of course, a positive sign. And as we mentioned at the outset, a lot of this tourism is being driven by people's ability to drive to the region. And another encouraging sign for the sector, we're seeing that hotel occupancy rates are also much higher in San Luis Obispo than in other parts of the state. So higher than we see in Napa, higher than we see in Santa Barbara County, but higher than we see in the state generally. So the average occupancy rate in California stands at around 55% compared to around about 65% in San Luis Obispo. Again, these are encouraging signs for what has been the worst hit sector. Construction activity also has contracted in the region. But again, the good news is that there's a steady pipeline of activity, which is increasingly coming online. And as we look out into 2021, we expect to see a strong snapback with respect to construction activity. And of course, we'll return then to one of the sort of pre-existing problems, which is that, again, speaking to members of the local community, in this instance, Pat Arnold, one of the problems that the construction sector is going to face as we go out into 2021 is the tighter labor market. And then finally, the healthcare sector, which is the second largest employer within San Luis Obispo County. As we can see here, there was a significant contraction in healthcare employment, which is somewhat counterintuitive, right? We would have expected that we have this public health crisis and what this would lead to is a demand for healthcare workers. But what actually we saw was a reticence from consumers to visit hospitals, but also hospitals were freeing up capacity to deal with potential demand as a result of COVID-19, which in the short term did lead to a contraction of the sector. And of course, as we head into 2021, we expect to see positive growth there as well. So the labor market, the recovery is underway. It has slowed somewhat, but as we go out to 2021 and hopefully move and get to a period where we can start to put the pandemic behind us, we would expect to see a sharper snapback with respect to the labor market. How has business activity been faring in 2020? Well, these data here, unfortunately, end in Q2. So this is a snapshot of how business activity looked at the end of June, when you can see that taxable sales had increased by about 16% year over year. But I really wanted to show you this chart to show you the sectors that had been impacted. And if you look at the bottom two rows of this column, you see that hotels and restaurants, there was a 42% contraction with respect to business activity, and fuel and service stations saw about a 44% contraction. And this makes a lot of sense, right? We're driving less, we're working from home, there's less demand for gas. The good news is that if we look at more recent data which are provided to us by credit card companies, we can see that sort of after we got June behind us in San Luis Obispo, sort of spending activity has picked up. Again, still not quite where we would like it to be. And you know, the growth or the return of the consumer has moderated somewhat in the last couple of months, but you can see a very clear upward trend in consumer activity. Finally, with respect to the 2020 economy, just want to talk about perhaps what has been the most positive aspect of the San Luis Obispo economy, and that is the real estate market. So if we were to look at Q3 figures, sales figures, we can see that in San Luis Obispo County, home sales were up 16% compared to Q3 of 2019. Now, there is a extent to which that number is a little bit amplified because activity in Q2 was suppressed, and a lot of that Q2 activity that would have occurred got pushed out into Q3. But the resiliency of the housing market has been nothing short of exceptional as we've moved into the sort of second half of the year. What we've also seen as well is strong house price growth. So between February and May in San Luis Obispo, we saw house prices contract by around about 1%. But from May to September, we've seen very impressive house price growth, which has led to all-time high home price valuation. So the residential real estate market in San Luis Obispo has been incredibly resilient as we've moved from the depths of the sort of economic fallout seen earlier this year in March and April. Again, if we were to look at permitting trends on a year-over-year basis in the Q3 of 2020, we saw 13% more single-family permits issued than were issued in the same quarter a year earlier. But where we have seen sort of a contraction in the issue of permits is with respect to multifamily permits. So while it's the case that single-family permits have snapped back, the issuance of multifamily permits are still considerably down in San Luis Obispo compared to where they were at the similar point in the prior year. Construction activity also has bounced back in San Luis Obispo. Now, as you can see here, construction activity in the region has been dominated by the construction of single-family homes. But as you can see, after a contraction of construction activity in Q2, in Q3, we saw a lot of that construction snap back, which again is bullish for the construction sector and a lot of those workers who have been displaced as we continue into the end of year and into 2021. And then finally, with respect to commercial construction activity, we see a similar pattern to what we've seen in the with respect to multifamily residential units. We have seen contraction on a year-over-year basis. And in the chart on the right, you can see what has really been driving that is construction activity with respect to retail. So the retail sector has effectively brought down the rest of the commercial activity space with it as we've moved into Q3 of this year. And then finally, one of the narratives surrounding the COVID economy has been what would happen to office and retail commercial real estate. And there was the idea that as more of us worked at home, that we would see a dramatic fall in demand for office space and that we would see office rents plummet. There was also an idea as well that these secular trends towards more online activity that we've been seeing over the last 20 years were accelerated during the pandemic, which would have impacts on retail real estate in the short term. But as of right now, this is not showing up in the data. So if we were to look at the office sector in San Luis Obispo, the change from Q2 to Q1 of this year in vacancy rates, there was just a very minor increase of around about 0.2 percentage points in the vacancy rate. And in fact, the cost of rents increased in the office space in San Luis Obispo County over this period. We see a very similar picture in retail as well, where we've effectively seen flat change in rents. Rents have just decreased a hair by around about 0.1%, but we haven't seen a dramatic fall in rents that many might have thought we would have seen as a lot more activity moved online. And the same is true with vacancy rates, which have actually decreased with respect to the retail sector. So again, a lot of the noise that we heard about the pressure that would be on the commercial real estate sector is not borne out in the data in San Luis Obispo County at present. Finally, I'd just like to sort of look out to the year ahead. As I mentioned a number of times in this presentation, there are sort of short-term headwinds. We have to contain this virus, but there is positive news. It seems that every day, we're hearing more and more encouraging news with respect to vaccines. And it seems like the biggest question now is how quickly we can distribute these vaccines rather than when vaccine was going to come. And just the positive point from the perspective of San Luis Obispo County and for California more generally is that a lot of the economic damage and fallout that was sustained this year was not due to some sort of structural problems. It was not due to a build-up in household debt, which is going to take years to repair. And that means that once we can move beyond the pandemic, we're going to be able to return to some sort of semblance of normalcy a lot more quickly than we have been able to after previous recessions, which have been driven by more fundamental and structural issues. As we look into 2021, we see a positive outlook, particularly in the second half of the year. As we get winter out of the way, we should expect to see a very strong rebound in employment with respect to the leisure and hospitality sector. We're going to see continued strength in housing demand. But remember what I was saying at the outset. The pre-pandemic economy in San Luis Obispo was strong, but it was starting to hit capacity constraints. And there is a big picture here that for businesses to continue to expand employment in San Luis Obispo, the big picture matters. And growth is ultimately going to be constrained by housing supply, and the trajectory for the economy over the medium and longer term is going to be determined by the amount of housing which is constructed in the region. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Apologies for the slight snafu at the outset, but thank you very much, and I'll hand things back to Bob.
Thank you, Tanner. I think you need to stop your screen sharing now. Thanks. And I thank you all of those folks who sent messages on chat that you couldn't see Tanner's screens. And apparently also I want to thank Michael, who very cleverly said, I think we will get graphics again when we have a vaccine. So very cute, Michael. Looks like a mixed bag for San Luis Obispo County, but lots of good news there. Certainly some green shoots, as he mentioned, and hopefully those will flourish into full-blown flora and fauna on hospitality and construction and so on. We remind you that you can still ask questions on the chat box. We've got several in the book already, but we can always use some more. And I remind you again that this is being recorded, and you will receive a link by email to the recording after this is over. Now we're going to have a word from another of our platinum sponsors, the people that make boxes smile, Amazon.
Hi, I'm Josh Tang, site lead for Amazon's San Luis Obispo office, where we currently employ more than 150 talented tech and corporate Amazonians. We're the team that locally builds and runs the Kindle Direct publishing service to help authors earn a living doing what they love. We're also part of the team that's responsible for building software to help get packages to your door. As part of the community, Amazon Web Services is powering the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub through our Cloud Innovation Center program. We love being a part of this community, and we're honored to have many of you as our customers and selling partners. We support the Central Coast Economic Forecast to help bring the important economic information you need to this region. You can visit the Amazon Day One blog for more information on Amazon's investments in California and around our nation. I hope you enjoy the event, and now back to the forecast.
Thank you to Amazon for their sponsorship. Now we have time for one more red and green question through our poll. We're going to bring that up now for the audience poll. The question is, do you expect any changes, and these would be substantive changes you've made in the way you operate this year, to be permanent, even after the pandemic is over? So whether it's working from home, doing things touch-free, Zooming versus traveling, whatever, will it be a lasting operational change? If you would vote yes or no, we'd appreciate it. We'll tell those results in a little bit. And while you're voting, I will tell you that Adam Fowler is the Director of Research at Beacon Economics. Adam leads the firm's Sustainable Growth and Development practice area and its Housing, Land Use, and Real Estate Advisory. His projects focus on housing and population trends, the creative economy, public opinion and attitudes, public policy analysis, and regional economics. He's also the Director of Research at the UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. That's quite a mouthful. Adam recently keynoted a virtual conference for America's Jobs Center of California, delivering a forecast for employment and other indicators for 2021. Adam is here today to share some best practices for economic development in the age of COVID-19. Adam?
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be with you this morning. I appreciate that kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if I can do a little bit better than my British colleague here. There we go. So thank you very much. I'm here to talk a little bit today about what Beacon Economics is thinking about when it comes to economic development in the age of COVID. The COVID-19 challenge has been really fundamental to the way both our urban areas work as well as the economy as a whole. When we stop and think about the challenges of a respiratory pandemic, they really cut at the heart of how lots of sectors in our economy operate, right? When we think of our big cities, of our agglomeration economies, that really is a function of bringing folks together, facilitating interactions, bringing diverse people and activities together in a place to build on those individual competencies, to make the sum of the parts more, really more than each individual component. And so right now, there are some things we can control. I think a lot of the virus has made us feel like we are outside of our control. The variables of the pandemic sometimes feel like we locally may not be able to control our destiny as much as we would like or as much as we historically have. And I'm here to talk about a little bit some of the things our research team has been looking at, analyzing, thinking about as we move forward. So not only kind of navigating the pandemic economy, but shifting gears to recovery, resilience, and the future after the pandemic ends. And I think it's really important that we all think about whether or not we are entering a period of decline in our local communities or putting the groundwork in place to come back even stronger, more resilient. That's going to really depend on a lot of our choices locally over the next few years. So what I want to do is empower everyone a little bit. So sometimes the macro variables, trade policy, big picture, monetary policy, those aren't things that we really have the ability to control. The virus as well falls into that same category, but we need to feel empowered, I think, especially around economic development, to tackle those things that are very much in our control, both in the state and in our local communities. I think there are a number of kind of misconceptions out there that are really worth tackling today, talking a little bit about, hopefully helping facilitate or start some conversations in your local community there on the Central Coast. I think to some extent it's a mistake to assume that the behavioral responses that we've seen to COVID, and they've been across a number of dimensions. If we think about looking at maybe public transit ridership, or a lot of the headlines about buying homes in the suburbs versus our dense urban downtowns, I think it's a mistake to assume that all of those are going to continue unabated after we see effective vaccines and treatments, and we really get the virus under control in a meaningful, robust way. However, in that same kind of set of headlines, I do think it's worth teasing out that there have been changes in a lot of our businesses and a lot of our firms, in a lot of the ways we do things that demonstrate better ways of doing things that may reinforce a few of those trends, such as the CARES Act allowing for more telemedicine or working from home. I think about the conversations I've been able to have and the presentations I've been able to be a part of that have really been made more accessible because of Zoom and kind of the online shift in a lot of knowledge economy work. And so there are things that we have seen that are better than they were. And you see that oftentimes in most business cycles, in most downturns. It gives us an opportunity to break out of old habits. And I think those things are worth thinking about as local jurisdictions moving forward. So I like to think that COVID has really accelerated our existing challenges, as I've got there on the slide. And the future of economic development, we've been saying for a long time, is talent. 20, 30, 40 years ago, when you talked about economic development, the sole focus was bringing that big box store to your jurisdiction, trying to poach the firm from a neighboring jurisdiction, neighboring state, somewhere else, luring businesses into communities. I think for a large number of industry sectors, talent has been made more flexible just because of our rapid need to reassess, deploy technology in a way we just didn't have the incentive before to think about. So the power of economic development is really going to be having talent in your community. Finally, I want to say that I think we need to make sure we're not attempting to recreate the past rather than feeling empowered and creative to envision a different future. A lot of the economy will come back, as Chris mentioned, Tanner mentioned, is already on its way back, but there are going to be very important shifts under the hood of the car that are taking place that we need to make sure we capitalize and use to our advantage. So quickly here, I'm going to focus on really three key areas. for the Central Coast. Housing matters. As I mentioned, housing was a constraint to economic growth in California and locally on the Central Coast well before COVID came along. I think the challenges of that constraint now take a different role when we think about the opportunity to bring knowledge workers from Los Angeles, from San Francisco, to our communities to bring their households, their families, their consumption patterns into our communities for our local businesses. The housing constraints and the downstream costs associated with those constraints don't make it as appealing as it should. So when folks talk about looking for opportunity around housing affordability, leaving the Bay Area, the price point, the amenities, those things really kind of nix a lot of our jurisdictions in California, and that's really too bad. Jobs need beds, and our remote workers, in whatever form that takes in the future, even if that's hybrid, part in the office, part remote engagement, they need space. So as Chris mentioned earlier, it's not only just the units. We've got a lot of backlog in terms of our overcrowding rates all across the state. So the Housing and Urban Development has a metric where we talk about more than one body per room. And so when you've got folks in those categories, there's just not the space to set up a desk. You may be deploying a kitchen table or something like that. So that opportunity isn't equal to those folks that have those overcrowding challenges. The second one is new business won't look like old business. While we still are trying to understand the behavioral change and what new industries might emerge and how the nature of work might evolve, we do know that there are going to be shifts in how the new economy is different. And it's critical to help as many businesses survive as possible. So lots of jurisdictions across the state have been really ramping up streamlined permitting for outdoor dining. The federal government implemented the PPP program. But at the same time, we also need to make sure the environment is there to support innovation and growth on things that don't look like the old things, right? So oftentimes our regulatory framework is built around things we know, old ways of doing things, whether that is a parking set of directives or the nature of size of retail space in a mixed-use project. So investments in infrastructure in the public realm need to have the flexibility to adapt to these emerging patterns of living, working, and traveling. And we've seen that in terms of lots of jurisdictions across the U.S. kind of liberating their assets. So thinking more creatively about assets that are part of the county or city or the jurisdiction, making those available to businesses that need some support, utilizing park and curb space. And I think in the San Luis Obispo area, the strong asset there in the community, the architecture program at Cal Poly, I think is just a remarkable resource in terms of thinking about space in the city. Quickly, I'm going to go through, at Beacon Economics, we really plug in kind of our component parts into three broad categories. So when we're thinking about economic development, we're thinking about the human, the physical, and the organizational. I talk about some of the components there, not worth really understanding here, but I'm going to pull from this kind of framework to talk specifically about three, I think, really in the Central Coast are going to be very important as we kind of build on the recovery that's taking place and begin to think about the new normal. So one is attracting skilled talent. The second is that urban renewal lens. And the final is really about the new retail. So what I think is important and is an opportunity for a lot of jurisdictions is that this crisis has opened up a lot of our minds, firm leadership, organizational leadership, to what really needs to be done within a central office's walls. What kind of work, as Chris mentioned, the collaboration, that valuable collaborative work, and then what part of that mix day in and day out can be done elsewhere and remotely. What does that new hybrid look like? What percentage of our work can be remote? And the ongoing length of this crisis has really required a lot of firms, both big and small, to turn the wheel of the ship, as you might say. The huge undertaking involved in digitizing assets and processes across a number of functions. You know, you think about an IT department maybe being more remote, but we've seen it across departments at firms large and small. So I think during the early months of the pandemic, there was a kind of all hands on deck to operationalize the new normal. But as that has become more permanent over 8 months, we've been able, you know, leadership in organizations have seen that it's not quite as scary. And, you know, what might have felt like big upfront costs to move to a world that was more hybrid have been invested in, and that kind of investment has paid off in the ability to kind of survive the challenges we've seen. You know, a number of reports have said that folks actually envision the change. It's not been as challenging or tough as they thought it was going to be early on. You've also seen a lot of jurisdictions start to be creative. As I mentioned earlier, economic development, the idea of talent being a real important lens to the long-term health and vitality of communities. So the baby boomer generation, the largest group now finally beginning to be eclipsed by the millennial generation, has begun to kind of age out of the workforce in a lot of jurisdictions around the country. And so for a whole host of public goods, public policies, a young, vibrant, working age population, their consumption habits are very important to a lot of promises we made, not only in terms of pensions, but the way our public goods, public financing are structured. So you've seen a lot of very interesting experimentation going on. I highlight Tulsa here, but Tulsa is by far not the only jurisdiction that's beginning to think about, you know, trying to make a pitch to bring highly educated knowledge workers who may already be working remotely and integrate them to a community they may not think about. Arkansas, Alabama, there are a whole host of jurisdictions that are doing some really interesting experiments. And in Tulsa, of almost 350 households that have participated, only 5 or 6 have actually left over the extended time horizon. So these programs in early data are beginning to show that there is a stickiness, that folks that are looking for opportunity may be thinking differently, that our traditional urban centers aren't the only place where you can really take advantage of what you want your career to be. You know, as Tanner's slide showed, it's harder in San Luis Obispo, looking at that median price for a single family at $685,000, roughly in line with the $700,000 in California. That's really tough. You're not terribly far away from the price points in the big urban areas like San Francisco, and there are neighboring states and neighboring jurisdictions that are able to make a value proposition a lot easier around affordability than many of our California jurisdictions are. Regarding and I flagged the Central Coast, but it's a California problem. Our housing units per capita, again, before the pandemic, really the lowest, only behind or in front of Utah. And the demographers in the group would talk about kind of religious and cultural influence on the nature of households there. So Utah is a little deceiving in terms of why that metric holds. But California really lacking. So in terms of the number of units per human being in a state, we're really at the back of the pack. And at our current trajectory, Utah actually would begin to eclipse us in a number of years. And the burden is both for those that rent as well as those households that own. And I think that is, you know, oftentimes in conversations about affordable housing versus market rate housing, multifamily versus single family, a lot of the homeowners in the state are burdened as well. And that is a challenge that may take second or third rung to some of the renter affordability challenges, but in terms of attracting talent, does play an important role. Shifting gears a little bit to the second thing I want to talk about, just given my limited time, is the nature of retail. And for a lot of jurisdictions, I think we need to begin to have the conversations now about what that future looks like. I highlight here just a few of the high-level kind of bankruptcies of brands we've known for a long time. Overall retail sales during this pandemic, by July, because of a lot of the CARES Act government transfers, have exceeded the pre-pandemic levels. That shift of that additional income from services to goods. However, sales in physical stores, especially mall tenants, have not yet regained anywhere near former sales. So much of those gains have been kind of occupied or taken up by online retailers. Again, data often lags in economics, so we're forced to look at creative proxies for the state of our small businesses in California. One of the interesting data sets I continue to look at and reference is the Yelp economic report, where they're able to capture interaction from business owners on their Yelp page about the nature of their hours, et cetera, but also suspensions, closings, other public health reactions. What we've seen is, as both Tanner and Chris mentioned, restaurants have continued to be among the most impacted, with an increasing number of closures. There is some subtle variation, right? So foods that work well for delivery and takeout have been able to keep their closure rates a little lower than others. Things like pizza places, delis, bakeries, even food trucks, right? Retail and shopping are really right there behind, closely behind restaurants, as well as bars and nightlife establishments with a relatively high closure rate. For additional retail, we've seen, again, you can see it in the aggregate consumption patterns, consumer behavior data. We've seen a lot of men's and women's retail clothing, home decor close, along with many of our beauty industry storefronts. We see it in terms of a number of metrics as well, in terms of looking at rent collections by property type. Retail is beginning to climb out, but if you look compared to multifamily, the ability of folks who may have been unemployed to deploy some of that government transfer in terms of the federal topper and unemployment insurance before it expired, and other things have kept those relatively stable, whereas retail has had a bit more of a challenge, beginning to climb out, but a bit more of a challenge. Delinquency on those mortgage-backed securities, those loans, on the far left there, hospitality, not necessarily a surprise, as business travel is a number of public policy mandates about flying and no-fly lists from various countries have taken effect. But number right there coming in second, we see retail having challenges. And so it's the thing that's worth flagging here is, while we think about, and even that slide earlier showed a lot of our big brands that really dominate our thinking about the retail space, a lot of this sector is dominated by small business tenants. And, it's kind of funny when you think about the cost structure or the business model. You really have a lot of kind of fixed cost in terms of your rent, your staffing, your wages for the people that are running that space, as well as the cost of having inventory on site. So it doesn't take much of a blip to really throw that business model into a bit of turmoil. And we've seen a lot of thinking about this, especially in places that may have, retail activities that really depended on social interaction. So those food, entertainment, retail, those actually before the pandemic were those really strong performers. A few of the strong performers in retail that were carrying some of the other sectors that were performing well below historical trends. So I give a few examples here of where some creative local policy making has been helpful. And I always, you know, as the retail form changes, I think we need to think about what those default settings, whether that's lease terms, whether that is the size of commercial spaces that we are requiring for multifamily mixed use, thinking creatively about how we permit and allow those things to happen. You can think about, I like to think about food trucks. When food trucks first came on the scene, what were they doing? They were saving those entrepreneurs some of that overhead in terms of commercial. We weren't very good. It took us a little while to figure out as jurisdictions what to do with the food trucks. But you can think about that kind of morphing, that nebulous form of entrepreneurial activity being replicated over time. So, you know, in places like Oakland, I cited an interesting creative example of some experimentation about pop-up, you know, making sure that spaces and regulations are in place to allow, you know, temporary engagements more flexibly, especially in your downtown retail areas that may have a lot of vacancy signs up, breathing life back into those communities. And so it's going to require us over the next few years to really think creatively about replacing that general fund revenue, right? Sales tax has always been kind of part and parcel of how we think about what we're doing in our jurisdictions, but we're going to have to begin to look at different vehicles, whether that be through entitlement or development agreements, making zoning and making the flexibility more transparently part of kind of the currency about how we shift our funding sources over time. You know, we do that oftentimes in multifamily to the extent we can see density bonuses and other menus of incentives that help private sector developers tackle some of those social goods. So bringing on, you know, we trade those entitlements to bring on some below market units, and we've got to begin to think like that across a number of areas. In closing, I'm going to talk just for a minute or two on a couple things that Chris has flagged, and I want to bring that up and kind of put that into your court to think about. We are seeing a real uptick in new business creation. So folks that may be working out of their home, getting their entrepreneurship, moving something from a side hustle to an actual business in its permitted form. And so, you know, there is going to be a lot of unmet consumer demand in the future. And it is going to be a trove of opportunity for those businesses that are able to weather the storm and for new. And so thinking about where we can support and build an environment to make sure that our new young entrepreneurs, our new businesses are able to take advantage of that demand that it begins to rebound is going to be very important. We've seen as well in terms of physical retailing, a lot of brands that were kind of digitally native are looking to expand to an actual brick and mortar presence. So the reverse of trying to turn your storefront into an online platform, but bring your online platform in with some samples, some examples of the product to have that human interaction, to have that experiential consumption component is going to be important. I think finally, one of the things I found most interesting and the team has really been thinking about is deploying those public assets, parks, curbs, you know, as they relate to a short-term solution now, but beginning to think about as we figure out what behavioral changes are permanent, how we support that innovation. Where we think about, you know, as the bio mentioned, one of the things I focus on and research quite a bit is the creative economy. And our arts and culture has really taken a devastating hit. Some of the first industries hit and the last to come back online because of the nature of those performances in the business model, bringing people together. We need to be thinking creatively to the extent there are assets available to bring partnerships into, you know, thinking about theater and shows outside. We don't want to have an economic recovery without arts and culture there for us when we get back to full steam. That's not a recovery that anybody is going to find all that pleasurable. And so we've seen some rapid permitting and shifts as it's related to outdoor dining, repurposing spaces that we've left kind of on the sidelines. And New York and other places, and I think it's a great opportunity, have begun to bring architects into the conversation to help better deploy that space. Again, space being such a vital lever the local jurisdictions have in their control. Even in, I share a couple other examples here. Massachusetts, really the Department of Transportation there deploying extended supplies to help with those outdoor opportunities. So final slide here. In closing, as I talk about those component parts, at the top, there are both the short and medium term solutions and the long term solutions. There are a lot of ad hoc programs now that are solving for the immediate pain. To the extent we can think about making those solutions not just for the now, but for the future as well, that these aren't going to be solutions. This isn't going to be outrage that is going to dry up and come to an end after the immediate, the short-term crisis is over, but how that can translate and do double duty as long-term ongoing support and solution is going to be so very important to our recovery. So there is opportunity for long-term strategy at this moment. As I mentioned, talent is really going to be the name of the game and has been for a while. And finally, adaptive reuse of that commercial space. We don't all want to come back here in 10 years and talk about how that strip mall off of wherever has been vacant for this period of time instead of incubating new businesses and workers in our community. Policy choices at all levers of government right now are going to mitigate or reinforce changes, and that can either advance or damage our region's long-term prospects. And with that, I thank you very much for the invitation to speak today and look forward to the questions and answers.
Thanks, Adam. Some very innovative strategies being undertaken by different communities to battle the issues that we have here. I want to give you the results of our last audience poll, which was, do you expect any changes you made in the way you operate this year to be permanent, even after the pandemic is over? And 77% of our respondees said yes, they do, whether it's Zoom and travel or working from home, and 23% said no. Now, I know Chris had said earlier that he didn't expect consumer behavior to change a whole lot, and we'll see how we can reconcile that. For now, though, let's take a look at a video from another one of our platinum sponsors, AMF Media.
Hi, Lauren, can you hear me?
What?
Thank you for meeting me today.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, and we have to do the shoot 6 feet apart for safety.
I know.
Who's Joe?
I didn't say Joe, I said I know.
Oh, well, we're here today for the Central Coast economic forecast.
Yeah, it's gonna be cold today.
No, not that forecast, the economic forecast.
Oh, that forecast.
Maybe you just want to welcome everyone to today's event.
Great idea. On behalf of all of us at AMF Media Group, we'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Central Coast Economic Forecast. We hope you enjoy today's event.
Well, thank you, Val and friends at AMF Media for being a sponsor today. We're going to go back and ask Chris Thornberg now if he could take just 4 or 5 minutes and summarize today's forecast. Chris, are you?
Absolutely, Bob. And sorry, I had to change my background just a little bit here. So, yeah, just a quick wrap on what everybody said. Again, I hope you enjoyed the new faces today. In the past, I've done the show on my own, or we've had the opportunity, of course, to interact with some of our folks. But today, of course, an embarrassment of riches with both Tanner and Adam delivering what I felt were really informative presentations. Now, typically, I would already be plotting out my course through wine country, but of course, today we're not able to do that. So let me just go ahead and kind of do a quick wrap. Chris's takeaways, of course, look, the V recovery is well underway. We're not the 90% economy either. We're the 96% economy. And we'll probably be there for the next couple of months, given, of course, some of the challenges we're dealing with right now with the third surge in this. But remember, in as much as some sectors are under stress, others are actually surging ahead. And ultimately, the most important thing is there's little sign of long-run damage to the economy. In terms of the path ahead, obviously the current surge is a problem. The good news, 2 vaccines, and obviously, as I noted, plenty of dry powder and pent-up demand that will fuel the final stage of the recovery once we get this thing under control. And we're still predicting a return to almost full normality by late 2021. As for the election, it's divided power in DC and still a massive political divide among population. Again, propositions show the gap between Sacramento and our state's population as well. While we do have a big change in administration, and I feel like that will lead to some positive outcomes, at the same time, we are still a nation divided, and that's something we all need to sit down and deal with. And then last but not least, the big risks out there, of course, from my perspective, is not the economy. The path to recovery is already firmly in place. Now it's, of course, about inflation and federal debt, driven by, of course, excessive stimulus. Getting to Tanner, obviously Tanner had the look. I had to look at the local economy, focusing on San Luis Obispo, of course, among the Central Coast. Obviously, new COVID-19 restrictions. This is a big speed bump for certain sectors. What felt like a decent recovery in the early fall is now, of course, slowing down quite a bit. But again, a strong 2021 is expected. Labor market, of course, in the area has lagged the state just a bit. Obviously, the concentration on tourism has been a bit of a drag on that. And also, of course, the Cal Poly situation. Again, things that should be bouncing back well. Real estate, of course, if you have a home in San Luis Obispo, it's doing fantastic. If you're looking for a home in San Luis Obispo, it's not looking very pretty right now. Obviously getting more expensive. And of course, as for local commercial, again, some pretty dramatic numbers, but I want to go back to the idea that this is largely about the transitory shock. There's little, of course, signals that there's any kind of massive glut within the commercial real estate market. So I don't want you to walk away feeling too discouraged by all that. Ultimately, the big news is don't forget the long run. And, of course, and that has to do a lot with local housing and housing policy. And Adam, of course, gave you a view on economic development. And of course, he talked about it as economic development in the age of COVID, but really economic development efforts you're talking about are really things for the long run. Yes, there's no doubt that while COVID hasn't substantially changed the world around us, what it has done, of course, is afforded us lots of interesting lessons, whether it's about, of course, the accelerated pace of de-retailing and the massive excess supply of retail sitting out there that we just figured out how to do with. Obviously, the idea of attracting and retaining talent and how that, of course, links up to both housing supply and at some level what I would call the new modern urban living. A place like San Luis Obispo is so in need of what I would call an almost a downtown urban revitalization project. I would look no farther at Santa Rosa and what Santa Rosa put into place a couple of years ago in the back end of those fires and look about how the things they're doing up there could be applied to a city like San Luis Obispo to make it that kind of hip, cool, urban place that, yes, that the workers of tomorrow will want to flock to enjoy that kind of environment. Obviously, adaptive reuse of commercial space, which is a local government conversation. And then, of course, last but not least, policy choices at all levels of government, which really need to help the overall long-run process. We live in a world of what I would call hyperbolic hysteria. And anybody who ever proposes any kind of changes is immediately inundated with cries of end of the world, sky is falling kind of stuff. Change is the only constant. And we all have to understand that working with local governments, working with each other to make sure change is moving in a positive direction, that is how we need to think about things, not trying to lock the world down in super glue, if you will, to keep things always the same. That method has never, of course, actually worked. And then last but not least, Bob's takeaway. Well, of course, we think he's going to be getting a new set of season tickets next year. You look great in blue, Bob. Just saying, just saying. So very quick takeaway. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And let's go ahead and turn it over to you, because I'm sure you all have lots of questions for us, and we would love the opportunity to answer those.
Yes, I'm sure I do look good in blue. I'll probably keep my orange and black just in case. But again, my congratulations to you and all the other Dodger fans. I want to remind you, you can still submit questions. We have quite a queue of questions already set up. We'll start that in just a moment. And while we go through those, let's watch our final Platinum sponsor video from KSBY.
Good morning. I'm Richard Gearhart, right outside the KSBY studios, and I hope that you're enjoying this morning's forecast. We all know that this year has been like no other, and it's presented challenges for all of us. As we head into a new year, we want you to know that you can count on KSBY to remain right here on the Central Coast, delivering local news from the building up on the hill, overlooking beautiful San Luis Obispo. And on a personal note, I want to thank you for welcoming me into your homes for the last nearly 30 years. As a Central Coast native, getting to know you and your stories has been the highlight of my career here. We all know that there are many places you can turn to for news and information, but from all of us at KSBY, thank you for trusting us to keep you informed on the issues and challenges here on the Central Coast. Now back to the forecast.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks for KSBY for producing the videos and for being a major sponsor. We're going to get to our Q&A questions right now. And I'm going to, we had several questions, and I'll leave this to Chris or any of the panelists, about the exacerbation between the haves and the have-nots that the pandemic has brought about, particularly the disadvantaged in terms of lower income people, people of color being more hard hit. You showed it with the spending levels between low income and high income, and what strategies can be undertaken to try to reduce that. And if it can't be reduced, what are the economic and social consequences of that exacerbation?
Sure. Why don't I go ahead and jump into this? This, of course, all boils down to what is known as the K-shaped recovery. And I will take, if you will, a little bit of umbrage at the idea that somehow or other this is unusual. Every recession is a K-shaped recovery. That is to say, folks that are low skilled typically see their economic fortunes get hurt worse in the context of the downturn and take longer to bounce back. Now, the good news for the economy is in the couple of years up to, of course, the Great Recession, believe it or not, the inequality problem was starting to solve itself. In California, of course, the very tight labor markets had meant that those at the lowest level of education were actually seeing some of the biggest pay gains. The opportunities were there. And if you will, that tide finally started to lift all the boats. Very, very good news. And we even got in 2019 new data for 2019. We just got a couple months ago, data on wealth. And again, interestingly enough, you did not see a giant increase in wealth inequality between 16 and 19. Turned out, again, a very strong, tight labor market was giving lots of folks opportunities. The good news here is while in the short run, obviously, the hit is there, as it is typically. The unemployment rate for those without a high school degree or only a high school degree shot up much more than people with a college degree, but it is also coming down faster. And my feeling is the rapid speed of recovery is such that we will very quickly get back to that point where, again, folks have opportunities. Indeed, even among low-skilled folks, it's worth noting that there are some households that are suffering, particularly if you're linked to hotels, if you're linked to restaurants. On the other side of it, though, I mean, if you were a mid-level manager at Home Depot, you have more hours than you know what to do with. So I would not, if you will, go too far with this. Clearly, inequality is a problem in the United States. Wealth, as much, if not more so, than income. I do think this is a transitory shock. I don't think it's long-term. But ultimately we still have to do better among those who haven't had the opportunities to gain skills the way we do. And we think in the long run that is conversations about tax changes and how to move the tax burden around. It is also conversations about how to improve public education. We have a long ways to go, I think, for public education to meet the goals that we should be expecting of it. And of course, last but not least, remember, ultimately, the best way of helping low-skilled folks is to make sure there aren't too many of them, making sure more and more kids have the opportunities to get to college. Let's continue to focus on those long-run goals, and ultimately, that will continue to push us in the direction we need to be.
Okay, thanks. Tanner or Adam, any additions to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris gave a comprehensive response there. I would just say that, in the short term, the best panacea is reviving the economy. There's no doubt that the sectors which have been most affected by the fallout are the sectors which are comprised disproportionately of lower income workers and people of color. And yeah, Chris did a good job of handling the long-term structural issues. In the short term, yeah, the best panacea is just moving beyond the pandemic and opening up the economy again.
Okay. Thank you. We've had several questions about the exacerbation of the affordable housing problem. It's always been an issue here to have enough affordable housing for workers, and with the prices going up and up, and with development looking like it will be a good year coming up there. Do you have any panacea for that issue?
Yeah, well, okay, I'm going to have to jump on this, and I know Adam and Tanner have something to say too. But let me just start by saying it is not an affordable housing crisis. It's not an affordability issue. Okay, it's a supply issue that's impacting affordability. Okay, if you don't build enough housing, prices are going to go up to basically restrict the limited supply to those who can afford it. If you look at people in the San Luis Obispo or in the state overall, turns out that housing cost to incomes have been falling over the last decade. Now, that's happening because incomes are rising faster than housing costs. But ultimately, look, we just got the 2019 data from the American Community Survey, and we saw the biggest outflow of Californians to the rest of the United States. They are not fleeing taxes. They're not fleeing regulations. They are fleeing the lack of housing, period. It's build, build, build. Don't call it an affordable housing crisis. Call it a housing supply crisis. Start there and understand that you need more roofs. You're not going to solve this without more roofs. Somehow or other, we imagine that we can prevent the population of our county from growing because I love my wonderful nature and my empty hikes. But at the same time, I'm still going to have 3% job growth, and housing's going to be nice and cheap for my kids. The world doesn't work like that, all right? It just doesn't. I'll get off my soapbox. Adam, Tanner, you guys want to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, I think you nailed it. I mean, the constraints, I mean, it ties into the previous question. Historically, wealth has been generated through home ownership. And you want to talk about equity, you've got to go to our tax structure in California. The fact that a new homeowner is going to pay a lot more in property taxes on the same asset as their neighbor across the street for what? Because you arrived and put your flag down a little bit earlier. Historically, economics hasn't thought that was good behavior. We like to have a bit of equity there. And I think, in terms of affordable housing, the capital A, capital H, in the way it's determined by the financial instruments that are brought to bear. So, the taxes, the grants, the formal affordable structure, they run into the same problems that the market rate does. I can't stress that enough. In other talks where I show two buildings side by side that are both new, look the same, one being 100% affordable, one being market rate, the affordable housing cost per unit is driven up by extensive permitting delays, by a whole host of regulatory obstacles locally. And so, you can't solve the market rate challenge or the affordable challenge without getting into the weeds of the regulatory program. And for far too long, I think lots of policy wonks have been nervous to go to community meetings where you get screamed at. I think that's slowly beginning to change to make a humanitarian argument around housing, because it is very important to so many of these questions.
Okay, thank you. For any of them, any of you, how do you see spending budgets for state and local governments for infrastructure projects in 2021?
As always, I find myself being the biggest mouth on stage. I apologize. I'll just jump in. Look, the state had some cockamamie projection of a $54 billion deficit. No, not even close. High income people continue to make money, and they continue to pay the bulk of the income taxes, which fuels the state government. So Gavin's got lots of cash. He can continue to invest. Local governments is where the pain is at this point in time. And we know that local governments who rely on sales taxes, on TOT taxes, they're getting hammered right now. And obviously they need a lift. And as opposed to the state running around talking about how they can raise more money, they should be focusing on giving local governments the tools to be able to raise the revenues necessary to pay the bills they need to pay. We don't need more centralization of revenues in the state. We need to, again, help local governments lift themselves up. And they're not, again, talking about that. But when you really want to get into infrastructure conversations, you really want to know where the problems exist, remember, for almost 2 decades now, the federal government has fallen vastly behind on its efforts to support local infrastructure investment. The federal government has been a huge source of this. It was declining right through the middle part of last decade. There was a little surge during the Great Recession. And then, of course, after that, it just fell. And Trump, for 4 years of promises of an infrastructure package, nothing even close to that ever emerged. Here we are coming into this new administration. We clearly need a national infrastructure bill. But again, how are they going to do that while they're trying to close this multi-trillion-dollar budget gap? It is a problem. We need to take a step back. We need to understand. We need to invest in more in infrastructure. And ultimately, that means the federal government has to start focusing on the things it needs to focus on. We don't need another stimulus bill. We do need infrastructure.
Okay. Moving out a bit to nationally, Chris, this is for you. If you could get Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi in a room and you got to tell them what they need to do, what would you tell them?
First thing is everybody needs to cool their jets. We don't need any more of this ridiculous partisan craziness. That's not going to work, by the way, because both parties operate on partisan craziness. I mean, that's how they make their money right now. But I'd sure love to be able to sit down and explain to them that compromise shouldn't be a dirty word. It's as simple as that. But, you know, I'm actually kind of the wrong guy to answer this question because Adam's background is actually in political science. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to him. And come on, poli-sci guy, how do we make this work?
I mean, I'm blindly optimistic on lots of things. I mean, I'm hopeful that having a president that understands the workings of the Senate, compromise oftentimes means knowing what people want. And, you know, in political science, it's called log rolling. If so-and-so has a pet project, you build that in, get the votes you need. I'm hoping that legislative intuition helps Joe Biden. I mean, there's compromise is going to be the name of the game. And I think both sides, if they're acting pragmatically, can both get some of the things they want kind of in a number of omnibus packages. I think Chris nailed it on the head. Infrastructure is so important on so many different fronts. And I think it can act as a stimulus, right? Putting that money out for roads, bridges in California, our grid, as we begin to move away from fossil fuels in the United States, making sure our grid is resilient and able to accommodate and store energy sources. That is stimulus, but it's also lays the on-ramp for economic growth over the long haul. You know, things like airports, roads, that's the bread and butter. And I think that can kind of do both, and I'm hopeful.
By the way, before we leave this question, Adam, we do have, of course, this problem with the parties both parties seem to be out of touch with 80% of Americans. Tell people what your favorite solution to that is.
I don't know what you're setting me up for. What is my solution, Chris? I have lots of solutions, but
Adam has been very fond of the parliamentary solution. He thinks we ought to be looking to our Europeans.
Oh, yeah. Agreed.
Just to go have more parliament system, because in parliaments, you actually have more movement towards the center because third parties are better able to form. That's what I was talking about, Adam.
Yep.
But,
and they often have to be included.
Yeah.
Decision making. So, okay, Chris, what concerns you more? I remember 15 years ago, if you had a national debt that was, let's say 70, 80% of GDP, you were either Japan or a third world country. Now, U.S. is at 140% of GDP, and will likely have in the next couple of years a $9 trillion balance sheet on the Fed. It's 7 now.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll go to 9. Yeah. What is the greater concern for you, or are they equal?
Well, actually, what you're asking me is, what do you think, Chris? Are we becoming Japan, or are we becoming a third world country? Sadly, it's a third world country, because as much debt as Japan has, it's also worth noting that Japan typically runs a trade surplus. In other words, while they may have a lot of government debt, they have a lot of private sector savings that offsets that. In the United States, we have the exact opposite. For the last almost 30 years, or 25 years, we were running a consistent trade deficit. We are relying on the rest of the world and their savings, and that's not where you want to be. We do need to wake up. We do need to understand that this is our debt. But again, in this world we live in, I don't want to get into sociology here because it's not my space. But, I think 60, 70 years ago, if you think about the greatest generation fighting World War II, people had a global view. They had a long run view. They had, if you will, an image of tomorrow and the thought about the next generation. They're going to look back on us and call us the selfish generation. We don't have any sense of tomorrow. We don't have any sense of others. We're all so concerned with ourselves and convincing ourselves that our lives are terrible and that somebody's taking advantage of us, that the broader community needs are being completely left behind. That's very sad. And ultimately, we need to recognize that we are doing that. We like to point fingers at politicians and yell at them. Who elects those folks? We do. And why are we electing them? What are they telling us that we like? We have to look in the mirror and understand where these problems start.
Okay, and as I say on the Sunday morning interview shows, we're going to have to leave it at that.
Yeah.
We thank all of our presenters, our panelists for the presentations today. I think we hopefully learned a lot of information. Remember, you will get a link to this presentation, which was recorded by email. We ask you to fill out your evaluation form, your survey that will also come in an email, so we can learn from this and see what we can be doing better. So on behalf of the board, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. It's been an unbelievable year, but we have plenty to be thankful for, so happy Thanksgiving to you and yours. We wish you the happiest of holiday seasons, a fantastic 2021, which we will all welcome with open arms. So let's be safe out there. Have a wonderful Wednesday. Thanks very much again for joining us.